At a packed stadium exit, the doorway narrows until shoulders lock against shoulders. The people behind keep pressing forward, certain the crowd is moving, while those at the front can barely take a step. Nobody can turn. Nobody can run back. Yet the crowd is still moving forward. That is the trap. Motion itself has become confinement. How do you surround an army that is still attacking? In August 216 BCE, nearly 80,000 Roman soldiers advanced across the dusty plain of Cannae in southern Italy. Shields overlapped, standards above the masses. The commanders believed sheer weight would crush Hannibal's smaller army. Every rank behind them added pressure. Every step forward packed the ranks tighter. But the Roman army was not simply moving toward the enemy. It was moving into a space where its own size would become a prison. The soldiers at the front still had room to fight. Behind them, thousands more kept arriving. Take one Roman infantryman in the middle ranks. Call him Lucius. He carries a broad shield, a short sword, and two heavy javelins. But dust has already coated his mouth before he reaches the fighting. Across the field, the enemy line stretches beneath the hot Apulian sun. Lucius sees the center first. Gauls with long hair and painted shields, Iberians packed beside them. They appear to stand directly in the Roman army's path. The order passes down the ranks. Advance. Sand grinds beneath thousands of sandals. Shields knock against shields. The men behind Lucius keep pushing, and the men behind them push harder. He can feel the whole army moving as one enormous body. Then the Roman front strikes. The first javelins arc overhead. Some vanish into shields. Others punch into flesh. Roman swords come out, and Lucius drives forward with the men around him. The enemy center gives ground. Only a few steps at first. Then more. The Gauls stumble backward. Their line bends away from the Roman blow, and the sight sends a surge through the soldiers behind Lucius. They shout and press forward, certain the enemy is breaking. Every retreat looks like victory. Every yard pulls more Romans into the fight. But the field narrows around them. Lucius tries to swing his sword and finds another Roman's shield against his elbow. He raises his arm, but there is no room to complete the cut. The men on either side are just as tightly trapped. Their shields overlap. Their feet strike one another. When a soldier falls, the bodies behind him cannot step around. They climb over him or shove him deeper into the crush. The pressure comes from every direction except the one ahead. At the front, the enemy keeps yielding. Behind Lucius, fresh Romans continue arriving, filling every gap before a gap can even appear. The army is winning ground, but losing space. A horn sounds somewhere to his left. Roman troops turn toward another attack, yet the movement dies immediately. There is no room to face outward, no room to brace, no room even to see who is striking them. Then Lucius hears hooves. At first they are faint beneath the shouting. He glances over his shoulder and sees dust rising behind the Roman mass, far beyond the rear ranks. Through it, dark shapes move quickly across the field. Cavalry. The last open ground behind him is disappearing. Lucius turns back toward the enemy, but the men in front are still advancing. The Romans cannot retreat without crushing their own comrades. They cannot spread out without abandoning the line. They can only keep pushing into the soldiers who are giving way, and all around them the circle is tightening. The battlefield was Cannae, in southern Italy, and the tightening circle was Hannibal's double envelopment. The soldiers giving way at the center were not breaking in panic. they were withdrawing under control, step by step, allowing the much larger Roman army to follow them deeper into a narrowing pocket. Every Roman push carried more men into the trap. Then the shape of the battle changed. Hannibal's infantry on the wings turned inward, while his cavalry swept around the exposed Roman flanks and struck from behind. The troops at the center kept pressing forward, unaware that the space behind them was already sealed. What looked like Roman momentum had become confinement. Their army was still attacking, still moving ahead, and still obeying its commanders. But the front was bending inward, the sides were closing, and the rear had vanished. At Cannae, Hannibal did not stop the Roman army. He made it advance until it had nowhere left to go. The trap began with a line that looked ready to break. Hannibal's infantry was outnumbered, and he placed his weakest-looking soldiers in the center. Gauls and Iberians, packed beneath bright shields, with the best African troops held back on either side. The arrangement seemed backwards. The center faced the full force of the Roman advance, while the Africans stood at angles, not yet fully engaged. Hannibal's line also curved outward toward the Romans. The middle formed a shallow, deliberate bulge. It was not a wall meant to stop the legions. It was a hinge. As the Roman infantry moved forward, that bulge met them first. The Gauls and Iberians stepped into the impact, struck and scrounged, but they did not run. Now, their retreat was measured, fighting backward through dust and shouting, allowing the Roman mass to keep pressing into the space behind them. Every step made the center bend farther inward. To a Roman soldier, it looked like victory. The enemy was giving way. But every step forward carried the army deeper into the trap. This was the dangerous part of the plan. If the center collapsed too quickly, the Romans would burst through and split the Carthaginian army. If it held too firmly, the Roman army would not enter deeply enough. Hannibal needed his center to lose ground without losing cohesion, to look defeated while remaining under control. The Romans helped him do it. Their infantry had been formed in extraordinary depth, ranks stacked behind ranks. That gave the attack weight. Men in the rear pushed against the backs of those ahead, and fresh soldiers kept feeding into the same narrowing front. The Roman army was not spreading across the field. It was driving like a massive wedge into the center of Hannibal's line. That strength carried a hidden cost. The deeper the Romans advanced, the more tightly their own formation compressed. The front ranks could fight, but the men behind them had less room to swing a sword or raise a shield. Officers struggled to pass orders through the packed ranks. A movement begun at one end could take precious time to reach the other, and the shape of the battle was changing beneath their feet. The Roman line believed it was pushing the Carthaginian center backward. In reality, it was pushing that center into a hollow curve. The original convex bulge slowly became a pocket, with Roman soldiers filling its interior. The farther they advanced, the narrower their frontage became. Shoulders pressed against shoulders, shields jammed together. On the two sides of that pocket stood Hannibal's African infantry. These were veteran soldiers, better disciplined and less eager to chase the retreating center. They had been positioned with open space beside them, waiting for the moment when the Romans passed their outer edges. As the Roman mass moved inward, the Africans turned toward it. First, they struck the exposed Roman flanks. The attack did not come from far away. It came from the side, into men still facing forward and still trying to drive against the bending center. Roman shields were built for threats in front. Turning an entire deep formation sideways was nearly impossible. The front ranks could pivot a little. The ranks behind them could not. They were locked together by bodies, weapons, and the pressure of their own advance. The African units pressed inward like doors swinging shut. The Romans were still facing the Gauls and Iberians, but their left and right sides were being crushed by troops they had expected to remain outside the main fight. Their numerical advantage became a problem of space. 80,000 men could not all fight at once. Most could only push the men ahead, hear fragments of orders, and wait inside a crowd that grew tighter by the minute. The cavalry completed the shape. Hannibal had placed his heavier cavalry under Hasdrubal on the Roman left, facing the Roman allied horse. On the other side, Numidian cavalry kept the Roman cavalry occupied. The mounted fighting did not decide the battle in one instant. It cleared the edges piece by piece. Hasdrubal's horse eventually broke through the Roman cavalry. Instead of chasing fugitives across the plain, he turned back toward the infantry battle. This was the movement the trapped army could not afford. Carthaginian cavalry rode around the Roman rear and attacked from behind, where no escape route remained. Now the enclosure had 4 sides: the bent infantry center ahead, the African veterans on both flanks, and cavalry closing from the rear. The Roman army was still a single mass, but it was no longer a maneuvering army. It could not wheel. It could not open lanes. It could not retreat without first forcing its way through the men packed behind it. At the front, men fought because the men behind them kept pushing. At the rear, men died before they could even see the enemy. Between them, the army's size became a trap of its own making. Hannibal had not surrounded every Roman soldier with an equal number of opponents. He had surrounded them with pressure, blocked movement, and a shrinking strips of ground. Cannae was not a neat circle drawn around the legions. It was a tightening shape created by movement. The Romans advanced into it one rank at a time, until the army that had come to crush Hannibal could no longer turn its weapons toward every side, and when the last Roman lines collapsed, the disaster reached far beyond the dust of the battlefield. Ancient accounts disagree on the exact number, but tens of thousands of Romans and their Italian allies were dead, captured, or scattered across the plain. One consul, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, lay among the bodies. The other, Gaius Terentius Varro, escaped with a handful of survivors. Rome had lost not just an army, but one of its highest commanders in the middle of the Republic's greatest crisis. The losses cut through Rome's ruling class. Livy records that nearly 80 senators died at Cannae, along with men from the city's wealthiest families. These were the people who supplied officers, governed provinces, commanded legions, and carried the Republic's authority into the field. Now their places stood empty. Rome had expected to dictate terms to Hannibal. Instead, it had to find commanders for the next army, while news of the last army's destruction was still arriving. The survivors carried the shock home. Roads filled with wounded men moving south and east, many without shields, standards, or commanders. At Rome, families waited for names that might never be confirmed. The Senate faced a terrifying question. What happens when a republic has spent its best soldiers and still faces an undefeated army? The answer was not surrender. It was another levy. Rome raised fresh legions from citizens who had never expected to serve, from younger men, and, as the war continued, from groups normally kept outside the traditional military system. the city even armed slaves for emergency service. Cannae had destroyed an army, but it had not destroyed the machinery that could create another one. That difference kept Rome in the war. Hannibal had won the field, yet he could not replace his veterans at the same speed. His army was built from different peoples, Carthaginians, Iberians, Gauls, and Numidians, and every campaign cost him trained soldiers and experienced officers. Rome could lose an army and build another. Hannibal could lose a few thousand veterans and still feel the damage years later. The political shock was severe. Several communities in southern Italy shifted toward Hannibal, most famously Capua, Rome's richest ally on the peninsula. Others hesitated, but the alliance network did not collapse. Latin colonies, central Italian towns, and many allied communities remained tied to Rome through treaties, local rivalries, hostages, shared interests, or simple fear of what a Carthaginian victory might bring. Cannae opened a crack. It did not break the whole structure. Rome also changed the way it fought. It stopped offering Hannibal the kind of enormous, tightly packed target he had just destroyed. Instead of seeking one immediate decision, Roman commanders made the war slow, scattered, and expensive. They occupied strong positions. They guarded grain routes. They watched roads and river crossings. When the ground favored Hannibal, they refused battle and struck at his foragers, messengers, and isolated detachments. This was the method associated with Quintus Fabius Maximus, the Roman commander who had already learned that Hannibal could be weakened without being defeated in a single afternoon. Later, Roman generals returned to that method with greater discipline. Hannibal might burn a field or capture a town, but every month without a decisive battle gave Rome time to train replacements, repair alliances, and pull more soldiers into the war. Then the pressure moved somewhere Hannibal could not easily follow. Siege in Italy, he remained dangerous, but Rome forced him to guard scattered allies and defend supply lines instead of marching straight toward the capital. Across the sea, Roman armies attacked Carthaginian power in Spain, fighting for ports, mines, and reinforcements. Later, Rome carried the war into Africa under Publius Cornelius Scipio, forcing Hannibal to leave Italy and defend Carthage itself. Cannae had shown what an army could do when every part of the battlefield worked together. Centuries later, military students kept returning to the same image. An enemy fixed at the front, its flanks turned, and its rear sealed before it could escape. The pattern became known as the double envelopment, and commanders from Napoleon's era to the German General Staff studied Cannae as one of its clearest examples. But surround the enemy was the easy version. The harder principle was to hold the enemy's attention in front, move around both sides, and close behind it before the pressure broke. That required a disciplined cavalry arm, infantry that could bend without shattering, commanders who understood the timing, open ground, a wind that drove dust into Roman faces, and an enemy packed so tightly that its own strength became a prison. Most armies could not reproduce that combination. Their wings outran the center. Reserves arrived too late. Escape route stayed open. Cannae became a model because the principle survived the battlefield. It became a legend because almost everything had to go right at once. But Hannibal had not performed a magic. He did not simply tell his center to lose. The men in that center had to retreat without turning the movement into a rout. Gallic and Iberian soldiers stood under the first impact of the Roman advance, absorbed the pressure, and gave ground step by step. Every pace backward risked panic. One broken file could open a gap before the African infantry on the wings had time to move. They held because the withdrawal was controlled, and because the Romans kept pushing. Roman commanders saw the enemy center bending and read it as weakness. More men crowded into the narrowing space. The columns behind them pressed forward, leaving the soldiers at the front less room to turn, reform, or escape. The Romans thought they were driving Hannibal backward. In reality, every step forward was carrying them deeper into the trap. Hannibal's African infantry did not rush in at the first sign of movement. They waited on the wings, facing inward, shields ready. Their timing had to match the moment when the Roman mass was deep enough and disordered enough to be struck from both sides. Too soon, and the Romans could have turned toward them. Too late, and the center might have collapsed, or the Roman army might have broken through. The cavalry action was just as important. Carthaginian horsemen had to drive away the Roman cavalry, cross the field, and return against the Roman rear. Without that movement, an opening remained behind the legions. The trap would have been a pressure attack, not a sealed pocket. Even the ground helped. The plain near Cannae offered room for the armies to deploy, but once the Roman line advanced, its enormous numbers became a liability. Dust, shouting, shields, and bodies erased the clean view of the battlefield. Orders traveled slowly. A commander could sense pressures without seeing the shape closing around him, and every part of the plan carried a point of failure. If the center broke early, the Romans could have poured through. If the African infantry moved before the Roman mass was committed, the legions might have preserved space to maneuver. If the Roman commanders had kept wider intervals, held back reserves, or recognized the retreat as deliberate, Cannae could have become a Carthaginian disaster. Hannibal prepared the conditions. The Romans, through their own confidence and forward pressure, completed the shape. That is why the victory was so frightening. It was planned, but never guaranteed. It depended on exhausted men holding their nerve for a few more minutes than the enemy expected. And in those few minutes numbers changed meaning. Rome had brought more men to the field, more weight into the attitude, more weight into the advance, more bodies pressing toward the center. Yet every step narrowed the space in which those men could move, turn, raise shields, or bring a sword down. The army was still advancing. It was also losing the ability to fight. At the front, soldiers pushed into enemies who gave ground. Behind them, fresh ranks kept arriving, compressing the ranks ahead. On the wings, the Carthaginian cavalry had already taken away the open ground that might have offered escape. This was the paradox Hannibal had built his victory around.
Momentum could become confinement.
Confidence could drive an army deeper into the very position that destroyed it. By the time the Romans understood what was happening, the decisive movement was no longer Hannibal's. It was their own, Cinque Ocean. Every man pressing forward forced the men ahead into tighter ranks, while the behind them disappeared under cavalry and panic. The Romans were not trapped only when the circle closed. They were trapped when forward motion became impossible to stop, and every step ahead took them farther from freedom.